there is a particular kind of sadness that rarely announces itself. It does not arrive like failure. It does not arrive like heartbreak. It does not arrive like loss. Instead, it accumulates quietly, year after year, decision after decision, until one day you find yourself surrounded by evidence. The half-read books, the abandoned goals, the online course you never completed, the language you promised yourself you would learn, the business idea that once consumed your thoughts, the dream that once felt powerful enough to change your life. And the strange thing is, most of these things never truly failed. They simply stopped. Their endings were so quiet that nobody noticed, including you. That is what makes unfinished lives so difficult to recognize. They rarely collapse. They slowly dissolve, not through catastrophe, but through accumulation, a collection of beginnings that never became anything more. At first, this seemed harmless, but for some people, it becomes a pattern that follows them for years, sometimes decades. Every new beginning feels exciting. Every fresh start feels meaningful. Every possibility feels different from the last. And yet somehow the ending remains the same. The project slows down. The excitement fades. The commitment weakens. And eventually, another beginning appears on the horizon. Soon the cycle starts again. A new goal. A new identity. A new future. A new version of yourself. For a moment, everything feels possible. Then it disappears. Again. And after enough repetitions, a difficult question begins to emerge. What if my life is not defined by what I have done, but by everything I almost became? Because some people live difficult lives. Others live unfinished ones. And the difference between those two things is far greater than most people realize. Most people assume unfinished lives are created by laziness. But that explanation falls apart the moment you look closer. Many unfinished lives belong to intelligent people, creative people, curious people, people with endless ideas, people who can imagine entire futures from a single possibility. From the outside, they appear full of potential. And that word becomes important. Potential. Because potential is one of the most beautiful words in the human language. But it also hides a dangerous illusion. Potential points toward a future that does not yet exist. A future version of yourself. And sometimes that future becomes so attractive that reality begins losing its appeal. Because reality asks for something potential never does. Commitment. And commitment comes with a hidden cost. The moment you choose one future, countless others disappear. The moment you become one thing, you stop being everything else. And for many people, that is where the real struggle begins. Not with failure, not with discipline, but with possibility itself. Imagine standing in front of 100 different doors. Behind each door exists a different version of your future. Behind each door is a different version of your future. The writer, the entrepreneur, the artist, the person you always imagined becoming. At first, this feels exciting. The future appears limitless. Every door contains hope. Every possibility contains promise. And hope is one of the most intoxicating experiences the human mind can have. Because hope allows you to experience success before success exists. It allows you to imagine the destination before walking the road. It allows you to feel inspired before any work has been done. For a brief moment, the future shines brighter than the present. And in that moment, anything seems possible. But possibility has a secret most people never notice. Possibility is free. Reality is expensive. A dream asks nothing from you. Reality asks everything. A dream never encounters obstacles. Reality introduces them immediately. A dream never reveals your weaknesses. Reality exposes them within days. A dream allows you to imagine mastery. Reality forces you to experience incompetence. And that is where many unfinished lives begin. Not because people stop caring, because they finally leave imagination and enter reality. A person dreams about writing a book. In their mind, the book is brilliant, meaningful, important. Then they sit down to write. The words come slowly. The pages feel awkward. The story refuses to cooperate. Suddenly, the dream no longer feels magical. Now it feels difficult. Then another possibility appears, and the cycle begins again. At first glance, this looks like ambition, but something deeper is happening, because the person is no longer chasing achievement. They're chasing possibility, and possibility is almost impossible to lose. As long as the dream remains unfinished, it remains perfect. An unfinished dream can still become extraordinary, and that is where the trap begins. Because the moment reality enters the picture, the dream stops being a fantasy and starts becoming evidence. Because the moment reality enters the picture, the dream stops being a fantasy and starts becoming evidence. Evidence of who you really are. And limitations are uncomfortable, not because they make you less valuable, because they make you specific. They make you real. Most people believe they're afraid of failure, but often that is not the deepest fear. The deeper fear is discovering that reality cannot perfectly match the person they imagine becoming. Think about how many people spend years carrying a future version of themselves inside their mind. For years, this version of themselves feels alive. It encourages them, motivates them, follows them everywhere. But there's something fragile about imagined identities. They survive only as long as they remain untested. The moment reality arrives, the illusion becomes vulnerable, because completing something does more than produce a result. It produces evidence, and evidence changes everything. As long as the dream remains unfinished, your potential remains unlimited. You can still become anything, but reality narrows possibilities. Reality asks a question imagination never asks. Who are you when possibility ends? That question is uncomfortable, because possibility is generous. Possibility lets you believe you could become almost anything. Reality asks you to become something, and becoming something means accepting that you cannot become everything. Imagine a sculptor standing before a giant block of marble. Inside that marble exist thousands of possible sculptures. But the moment the sculptor begins carving, possibilities begin disappearing. Life works the same way. Every meaningful commitment eliminates alternatives. But beneath even that grief lies something deeper. Protection. Because eventually, a difficult question begins to emerge. A question many people spend years avoiding. What if I'm not protecting the dream? What if I'm protecting myself? What if the unfinished novel is not being protected because it is special? What if it remains unfinished because an unfinished novel cannot disappoint me? What if the unfinished business is not being protected because it has potential? What if it remains unfinished because an unfinished business cannot prove me wrong? Suddenly, the problem looks very different. The unfinished dream stays perfect. The completed dream becomes vulnerable. The unfinished dream stays alive. The completed dream faces reality. One remains protected. The other becomes exposed. And the mind notices this difference far more than most people realize. Because uncertainty still contains hope. Reality contains judgment. Reality contains limits. Reality contains answers. And answers can be frightening. Not because they reveal failure. Because they reveal truth. The truth about what works. The truth about what doesn't. The truth about who we are. And for many people, uncertainty feels safer than truth, because uncertainty allows the fantasy to survive. Reality forces the fantasy to speak. This is why unfinished lives are often misunderstood. People assume the person lacks discipline, but discipline is rarely the deepest problem. The deeper problem is psychological protection. The dream remains unfinished because unfinished things cannot die. They remain suspended in possibility, protected from judgment, protected from evidence, protected from finality, and that protection feels safe, at least for a while. But every protection comes with a cost, because while the dream remains alive, life remains paused, and the longer a person lives inside possibility, the more dangerous possibility becomes, because possibility has a shadow, a hidden cost, a cost that reveals itself slowly, quietly, year after year, and by the time most people finally notice it, they have already sacrificed something they can never recover. Time, and by the time most people finally notice it, they have already sacrificed something they can never recover. Time, because the tragedy of unfinished lives rarely announces itself. There is no dramatic collapse, no public failure, no catastrophic moment where everything falls apart. That is what makes it so dangerous. The damage accumulates quietly, almost invisibly. One abandoned project means very little. Most people barely notice it. A second unfinished goal feels normal. A third seems understandable. A fourth can be justified. Life gets busy. Circumstances change. Motivation fades. People move on. But eventually something begins to happen. The unfinished projects stop existing outside of you and start existing inside of you. Every abandoned goal leaves behind a question. Every unfinished dream leaves behind a possibility. And every possibility leaves behind a ghost. Not a ghost of what happened. A ghost of what might have happened. A reminder of a life that never fully arrived. This is why unfinished lives create a unique form of grief. A grief many people struggle to name. Because it is not grief for something lost. It is grief for something unlived. A possibility that never reached reality. And perhaps that is one of the heaviest burdens a person can carry. Not the life they lost. The life they almost lived. At first, the mind protects itself from this feeling. I'll come back to it later. Now isn't the right time. Maybe something better will appear. I just haven't found my true passion yet. Ways of avoiding a deeper realization. Because eventually, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The details are different, but the ending remains exactly the same. And when the ending stays the same long enough, the problem can no longer be the project. The problem must be the pattern. That realization is uncomfortable, because patterns point inward. They force us to stop examining the road and start examining the traveler. And for many people, that is where the real pain begins. Because unfinished lives do not only create external consequences, they create internal ones. Every abandoned commitment teaches the mind something, not through words, through experience. And eventually, that belief starts sounding like this. I don't finish things. My motivation never lasts. I always lose interest. I can't trust myself. At first, these thoughts seem harmless, but repeated often enough, they become identity. And once identity becomes involved, everything changes, because the deepest damage is not lost opportunities. It is lost trust. Trust in your own ability to stay. Without realizing it, many people stop believing their future self. The relationship becomes fractured, not with the goal, with themselves. And once self-trust begins disappearing, something else disappears with it. Depth. Because depth requires time. Depth requires repetition. Depth requires remaining long enough for transformation to occur. It becomes strong because it remained. It becomes meaningful because it endured. It becomes mastery because it survived years of imperfection. Everything valuable in life follows the same principle. Depth belongs to those who stay. But unfinished lives are built around departure, always returning to the beginning. And beginnings are seductive. The beginning feels alive. But transformation does not happen in the beginning. Transformation happens in the middle. The middle is where progress becomes difficult to see. And the middle is where most people leave. Not because they are weak. Not because they are incapable. Because they misunderstand what is happening. They assume the disappearance of excitement means something is wrong. But what if the loss of excitement is not a warning sign? What if it is a doorway? Because every meaningful path eventually becomes ordinary. Not because they are wrong. Because familiarity replaces novelty. And this is the moment where unfinished lives quietly separate into two different futures. One person leaves. The other remains. At first, their lives look identical. Years later, they look nothing alike. because the person who stayed discovered something the other never did, a hidden stage of growth, where transformation continues even when nothing seems to be changing. Most people never stay long enough to witness it, and that is why the unfinished life carries such a heavy cost, not because of what it loses, but because of what it never gets the chance to become. The greatest tragedy of unfinished lives is not failure. It is departure, leaving too early, again and again and again, until one day a person realizes they have spent years standing at the edge of countless lives, without fully entering any of them. And by then, the cost is no longer measured in abandoned projects. It is measured in time. Time spent beginning, time spent searching, time spent imagining, time spent waiting for certainty, while the life they wanted was quietly waiting on the other side of commitment, waiting in the place they kept leaving, waiting in the middle. And that brings us to the stage most people never reach. Part 4, the stage most people never reach. And that brings us to the stage most people never reach. The stage where transformation actually happens. Not at the beginning, not during inspiration, not while imagining a better future, but in the middle. The middle is where the excitement disappears. The future stops glowing. The path that once felt meaningful suddenly feels ordinary. And for many people, this is where the story ends. Not because they failed, because they misunderstood what was happening. They believed the loss of excitement meant the path was wrong. So they leave, and they begin again. But what if this moment was never meant to be an ending? What if it was meant to be a doorway? Because every meaningful transformation follows the same pattern. First comes inspiration, then uncertainty, then doubt, and beyond them, transformation. The problem is that transformation rarely feels transformational while it is happening. Most of the time, it feels ordinary. A writer produces hundreds of forgettable pages before finding a voice. A tree spends years growing roots before anyone admires its height. Growth often happens underground. And because it happens underground, many people assume it is not happening at all. That assumption costs them everything. Because the most important changes in life usually become visible only after they have already occurred. Confidence, discipline, mastery, and identity all work this way. The transformation is happening long before the evidence appears. But modern life teaches us to expect constant stimulation, constant reassurance, constant confirmation that we're moving in the right direction. And when that confirmation disappears, we panic. We assume something is wrong. Yet meaningful paths were never designed to provide constant excitement. In fact, the moment a path becomes ordinary is often the moment it becomes real. Because excitement can start a journey, but it cannot finish one. Motivation can begin the process, but it cannot sustain it. Eventually, every meaningful pursuit asks the same question. Who are you when motivation leaves? Who are you when nobody is watching? Who are you when progress becomes invisible? Who are you when the future no longer feels exciting? That is where identity is forged, not in moments of inspiration, in moments of continuation. Because there is a profound difference between being interested in something and being devoted to it. And perhaps the greatest misunderstanding of modern self-improvement is the belief that successful people feel motivated more often than everyone else. Most do not. They simply learn something others never did. They learned that motivation is unreliable, but commitment can be chosen, again and again, especially on ordinary days. That is the hidden stage most people never reach. The stage where growth becomes intentional rather than emotional. And ironically, that is where freedom begins. Because once you stop depending on excitement, you stop being controlled by its absence. Once you stop chasing the feeling of possibility, you become capable of building reality. And reality has something possibility never will. Substance, a life that exists outside imagination. Because possibility is beautiful, but possibility alone cannot change your life. Only action can. Only repetition can. Only staying can. And perhaps that is the deepest truth hidden beneath unfinished lives. More often, it is a problem of remaining, of staying long enough for reality to reveal what possibility never could. Because every unfinished dream protects a certain version of you. As long as the dream remains unfinished, those identities remain untouched. Protected, but a strange irony exists here. The very thing meant to protect identity eventually prevents it from growing. The endless preservation of possibility creates a life with no depth. A person spends years protecting who they could become, while never fully becoming anyone at all. And perhaps that is the saddest paradox of unfinished lives. The fear of limitation creates a far greater limitation. The fear of choosing creates a life that never fully arrives. The fear of becoming something specific creates a life that remains unfinished. Not because of inability, but because of avoidance. And once you see that, the question changes. It is no longer, what should I become? It becomes, what am I willing to stay with? Because meaningful lives are not built through endless reinvention. They are built through continuity, through patience, through remaining present long after excitement leaves. And trust may be the missing ingredient in almost every unfinished life. Not trust in success, not trust in certainty, trust in staying. Trust that reality deserves a chance to answer the question imagination keeps postponing. Because one day, years from now, you will meet the consequences of your choices. Not all at once, not dramatically, quietly. You will meet them in the person you became, the life that slowly took shape beneath thousands of ordinary days. And when that moment arrives, the question will not be, did I choose the perfect path? Very few people ever do. The question will be, did I stay? Did I give reality a chance? Because perhaps the purpose of life was never to become everything. Perhaps the purpose was to become something real. Because the life you're searching for may not be waiting at the next beginning. It may be waiting in the place you've been trying to leave. The middle, the ordinary, the unremarkable days where nothing seems to happen. Because that is where roots grow. That is where character forms. That is where identities are built. And that is where unfinished lives finally become complete. Not through inspiration, not through potential, not through perfect decisions, but through one simple act repeated over time. Staying,